kind of man could make an entire military base fear a signature more than a battlefield? What kind of monster could make hardened soldiers walk away from a fortune without even touching the pen? And what happens when the only man willing to sign that contract is someone everyone believes is walking toward his own funeral? Under the harsh white lights of Fort Benning's massive mess hall, a single table stood alone like a trap waiting for prey. There were no guards surrounding it, no dramatic speeches, no threats. Just a contract, a black fountain pen, and behind military-grade glass sat a mountain of cash worth $1 million. Real money. Enough to buy houses. Enough to rescue entire generations from poverty. Enough to change the future of a family forever. Yet for 3 endless days, nobody touched it. Not the Rangers, not the boxing champions, not the combat veterans who had stared death in the face and survived. Every soldier who entered the hall eventually found his eyes drifting toward the contract. Then, almost immediately, looking away. The reason was simple. The money wasn't the prize. The money was bait. To claim it, a man had to climb into a ring with Sergeant Dalton Marrero, and everybody on that base knew exactly what that meant. Because Dalton Marrero wasn't famous for winning fights, he was famous for ending them. The giant stood closer to a force of nature than a human being. At nearly 7 feet tall and weighing almost 350 pounds, he looked like something built for war rather than born into it. His shoulders stretched so wide that ordinary doorways seemed too small for him. His forearms looked thicker than some men's legs. When he walked across concrete, people swore they could feel vibrations through the floor. The first time new recruits saw him, they usually laughed. The second time they saw him, they didn't. Nobody could explain it properly. There was simply something wrong about how powerful he looked. Like nature had accidentally gone too far. But his size wasn't what frightened Fort Benning. The stories did. Stories whispered in barracks after midnight. Stories repeated in training yards. Stories that grew larger every time they were told. And the worst part? Most of them were true. One afternoon during a military strength demonstration, hundreds of soldiers gathered around a training field expecting a routine exhibition. Nobody expected to witness something that would become legend. Dalton Marrero walked toward a military jeep. Several soldiers laughed. Others assumed he was going to push it, maybe pull it, maybe pose beside it. Instead, he crouched, wrapped his enormous hands beneath the front frame, and lifted. The front wheels rose off the ground. Gasps exploded across the crowd. The vehicle hung there, suspended, held in the air by pure strength. Men stared in complete disbelief. A military physician checked Marrero moments later. His heartbeat had barely increased. It sounded impossible. Yet impossible things seemed to follow Dalton Marrero wherever he went. Then came the fight that transformed respect into fear. Corporal James Hadfield, the Army's most feared boxer. A man whose fists had crushed opponents across multiple countries. A warrior built from discipline, pain, and years of combat. When Hadfield challenged Marrero to a sparring match, excitement swept across Fort Benning like wildfire. Finally, someone dangerous enough to challenge the giant. The gym overflowed. Soldiers packed every corner. People climbed benches. Others stood on equipment just to see. The atmosphere felt electric. The bell rang. Hadfield attacked immediately. Fast, explosive, violent. His fists became blurs. Powerful combinations hammered directly into Marrow's face. The sounds echoed through the gymnasium. Each strike would have dropped ordinary men. Each punch landed clean. Each impact looked devastating. Dalton Marrero didn't move. Not backward, not sideways, not even a fraction. He simply stood there, watching, absorbing, waiting. The scene looked horrifying, like a man trying to punch through a concrete wall. Then Marrero moved. Just once. One step, one grab, one violent motion. The crowd barely processed what happened. One moment Hadfield stood in front of him. The next moment his body flew through the air. The impact against the wall sounded like a car crash. The entire gym froze. Silence swallowed the room. The fight ended almost before it began. Broken ribs, a shattered wrist, months of recovery. That was the cost of challenging Dalton Marrero. Weeks later, from a hospital bed, Hadfield whispered words that spread across Fort Benning faster than any official report. It felt like punching a wall that punches back. After that day, nobody volunteered to spar him again. Not because they lacked courage, because they valued survival. And now that same man waited behind the contract. General George Patton had approved the challenge personally. The idea sounded simple. Find the toughest fighter alive, put him against Marrero, show the world military superiority. Instead, something unexpected happened. Fear won. For 3 days, the contract remained untouched. 3 days, thousands of soldiers, 0 signatures. The $1 million sat there untouched beneath the lights like forbidden treasure. Then, on the 4th morning, everything changed. A black sedan rolled through Fort Benning's gates. Nobody paid attention at first. Vehicles arrived every day. Visitors came and went. Nothing unusual. Then the driver stepped out, and confusion immediately spread among the guards. The man wasn't large, wasn't intimidating, didn't arrive with bodyguards, didn't arrive with reporters, didn't arrive with an entourage. He wore a simple dark jacket, dark pants, rolled sleeves, nothing special. Yet something about him felt different. His movements were calm, too calm. His eyes carried a level of focus that made strangers uncomfortable, not because they looked aggressive, because they looked completely fearless. Within an hour, the visitor sat inside Colonel Richard Ainsworth's office. Outside the window, Dalton Marrero trained. The giant hammered a heavy bag so violently that chains rattled overhead. Each impact sounded like artillery. The bag swung through the air as though gravity had stopped applying to it. Colonel Ainsworth watched silently before turning toward his guest. Concern filled his face. "Gentlemen like Sergeant Marrero don't belong in ordinary fights," he said carefully. The visitor listened, quiet, patient. The colonel opened a folder. 11 trained soldiers hospitalized. Another page. Several surgeries. Another page. Permanent injuries. The room became still. Then the colonel leaned forward. "You understand what you're signing up for." The man nodded. No hesitation. No nervousness. Nothing. That unsettled the colonel more than fear would have. Most people pretended to be brave. This felt different. This felt real. The colonel studied him carefully. The visitor's name was Chuck Norris. At first glance, nothing about him looked capable of threatening Dalton Marrero, which made his confidence deeply disturbing. Finally, Chuck asked a strange question, a question nobody expected. "Is there a pull-up bar nearby?" The colonel blinked. Minutes later, they entered a small training room. Several soldiers followed out of curiosity. Chuck walked directly to the bar. No stretching, no preparation, no performance. He simply grabbed it with one hand and pulled himself upward. Perfectly, effortlessly. Then again with the opposite arm. The room grew quieter. Chuck stepped down, picked up 2 heavy dumbbells, raised them outward, and held them perfectly still. Seconds passed, then more. Not a tremor, not a shake, not a sign of strain. Soldiers stopped smiling. Something felt wrong. Not because of his strength, because of his control. Everything he did looked precise, measured, engineered, like a machine executing instructions. Chuck finally lowered the weights. His breathing never changed. The room remained silent. Yet one terrifying question still lingered. What happens when Dalton Marrero gets his hands on him? Colonel Ainsworth finally asked it. Chuck looked through the window, toward the giant, toward the monster who terrified an entire military base. Then he spoke, softly, calmly. "I didn't come here because I'm stronger." Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Chuck continued. "Nobody here is stronger than Dalton Marrero." The colonel frowned. Then why come at all? Chuck's eyes never left the giant outside. When he answered, his voice carried the certainty of a mathematical law. "I came because strength is not what decides every fight." A chill moved through the room. No arrogance, no showmanship, no ego, just certainty, the kind of certainty that makes people uncomfortable. Slowly, Colonel Ainsworth opened his desk drawer. Inside rested the contract. The same contract thousands of soldiers refused to touch. The same contract nobody wanted. Chuck read every word, carefully, patiently. The sounds of Marrero's punches continued outside. Boom, 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 like distant artillery. Then Chuck reached the final page, picked up the pen, and signed. The scratching sound seemed louder than the heavy bag outside, because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. The moment the ink dried, Fort Benning finally had its challenger. And deep down, almost everyone believed they had just witnessed a man sign his own death warrant. The moment Chuck Norris signed the contract, Fort Benning exploded. The news moved faster than military orders. Barracks, training fields, mess halls, officer quarters. Every corner of the base buzzed with the same conversation. Some soldiers laughed, others shook their heads. Many genuinely felt sorry for him, because, from their perspective, the outcome was already decided. The only mystery was how long Chuck Norris would survive. By sunset, soldiers crowded cafeterias and hallways arguing about the fight. One ranger claimed the match wouldn't last longer than a few heartbeats. A military boxer insisted Chuck would never escape the giant's first grab. Others predicted the fight would end so quickly the crowd wouldn't even understand what happened. Nobody talked about Chuck winning. Not one person. Not yet. Then word reached Dalton Marrero. The giant stood inside the training facility, pounding a heavy bag suspended from thick steel chains. Each strike sounded like an explosion. Sweat rolled down his enormous shoulders. The bag swung violently through the air. A soldier approached carefully. "Someone signed." The giant didn't stop punching. "Who?" Chuck Norris! For the first time that evening, the heavy bag stopped moving. The chains rattled overhead. Silence settled across the room. Dalton slowly turned. His expression didn't show anger. It showed confusion. "How much does he weigh?" The soldier swallowed. "Around 180 pounds. The giant stared at him. Several seconds passed. Then Dalton looked away. "I'm not fighting him." The room froze. Nobody expected that answer. The soldier blinked. "What?" Dalton's voice remained calm. "I joined the army to protect people." His jaw tightened. "Not bury them." A cold chill swept through everyone present. Because those words came from the one man who knew exactly how dangerous he truly was. The story spread across Fort Benning before midnight. And suddenly the atmosphere changed. Because if Dalton Marraro himself believed Chuck Norris might die in that ring, what chance did Chuck actually have? The following morning, General Patton overruled the refusal immediately. The fight would proceed. No exceptions, no delays, no negotiations. The contract stood. The date was set. The entire base prepared for what many expected would become a public disaster. But then, something strange happened. Chuck Norris didn't train like a man preparing for a fight. He trained like a man solving a puzzle. Every morning before sunrise, while most soldiers slept, Chuck entered an isolated gym carrying only a notebook and a rolled exercise mat. No entourage, no cameras, no audience. At first. Then soldiers started watching, and what they saw confused them. Chuck repeated the same movement again and again and again, hundreds of times. The exact same motion, the exact same angle, the exact same foot placement, hour after hour, day after day. At first people laughed. They expected kicks, punches, sparring, heavy bags. Instead, they watched a man obsess over a single sequence. The laughter lasted only a few days, then it disappeared. Because something about the repetition became unsettling. Every movement looked sharper than the one before. Every adjustment seemed microscopic, yet somehow important. Chuck would stop, write notes, study, adjust, repeat, write again, repeat again. It didn't look like martial arts. It looked like engineering, like a scientist dissecting a dangerous machine. By the middle of the week, dozens of soldiers gathered around the gym every morning. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody interrupted. They simply watched. And the more they watched, the less they understood. One morning, Sergeant Thomas Wakefield, Fort Benning's most respected hand-to-hand combat instructor, finally approached Chuck. The instructor had spent years studying combat, years teaching soldiers how to survive violence, yet even he couldn't understand what he was seeing. Chuck completed another repetition, stopped, reached for his notebook. Wakefield stepped closer. "Why?" Chuck looked up. "Why what?" "The same movement." Wakefield folded his arms. "You've repeated it thousands of times." Chuck wiped sweat from his forehead. Then he asked a question, a simple question, yet it instantly changed the atmosphere. "If you knew you were facing a grizzly bear," he paused, "would you practice 100 techniques?" Wakefield frowned. Chuck continued, "Or one technique 100,000 times." Silence. The instructor felt something tighten inside his chest, because suddenly the repetition made sense. Chuck wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing for one specific moment, one specific opportunity, one specific opening. Wakefield glanced toward the far side of the gym, toward Dalton Morrow, toward the giant whose presence dominated the entire base. Then he looked back. Chuck's eyes never left the notebook. Finally, he spoke again. I cannot overpower him. No ego, no denial, just truth. I cannot outmuscle him. Wakefield remained silent. Chuck closed the notebook. So I am not preparing to fight him. The instructor frowned. Then what exactly was he preparing to do? Chuck's answer sent a chill through the room. I am preparing to solve him. Those words followed Wakefield for days, because they didn't sound like the words of a fighter. They sounded like the words of a strategist, a problem solver, a man studying a weakness nobody else could see. As the days passed, Chuck's movements became faster, cleaner, sharper, until soldiers could barely track them. One morning, Wakefield stood beside the mat holding a stopwatch. Chuck performed the sequence. The instructor clicked the timer. Less than a second. Again. Less than a second. Again. The same result. The movement looked impossible. One moment, Chuck stood in front of the mat. The next moment, he appeared behind it. Position secured. Control established. Everything locked into place. No wasted motion. No hesitation. No errors. The transition happened so quickly it felt unnatural. Wakefield stared at the stopwatch, then stared at Chuck. For the first time since the challenge began, a disturbing thought entered his mind. What if everyone was wrong? That afternoon he requested a private meeting with Colonel Ainsworth. The colonel listened carefully. Wakefield rarely overreacted. If he sounded concerned, there was usually a reason. "What is it?" the colonel asked. Wakefield hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Chuck has figured something out." The colonel frowned. "What?" The instructor took a breath. "He knows how to get behind Marrero." Silence. The colonel stared at him. Wakefield continued. "And if he gets there," he paused, "the fight changes." Ainsworth leaned forward. "Explain." Wakefield lowered his voice. Size stops mattering. The room became still, because both men understood exactly what that meant. A giant can overpower a smaller opponent face to face. A giant can dominate exchanges. A giant can overwhelm. But there are certain positions where leverage becomes king, and leverage doesn't care how much a man weighs. The colonel looked toward the window, toward the distant training grounds. For the first time since Chuck Norris arrived, doubt appeared. Not doubt about Chuck, doubt about Dalton Morrow. Days later, rumors finally reached the giant himself. At first he ignored them, then he heard them again, and again, and again. Eventually, curiosity overcame him. One morning, Dalton crossed the gym. The room immediately fell silent. Soldiers stopped talking, stopped breathing, stopped moving. The giant approached Chuck and simply stood there, watching, minute after minute. Chuck continued training, never acknowledging the crowd, never acknowledging the tension. Only the movement mattered. Again, again, again. Finally, Dalton spoke. His deep voice echoed through the gym. "You're practicing a choke." Chuck stopped, looked up, and nodded. The giant folded his massive arms. "Men much larger than you have tried." His expression remained calm. "I flex my neck," he shrugged. "Their arms fail." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every soldier in the building watched, waiting. Dalton took a step closer. "What makes you think your result will be different?" The silence felt unbearable. Chuck lowered his water bottle, then looked directly into the giant's eyes. No fear, no aggression, just certainty. When he finally answered, even the soldiers nearest to him felt chills, because his voice carried absolute conviction. "I am not choking your air." Dalton blinked. The smallest reaction, almost invisible, yet everyone noticed it. Chuck stepped closer. The gym felt frozen. Then he delivered the sentence nobody forgot. "I'm choking your blood." Silence, complete silence. The words landed like a hammer. For the first time in years, Dalton Morrow had no immediate response. And for the first time since the contract appeared, something impossible began spreading through Fort Benning. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence. Hope. Because suddenly soldiers started asking a question they never dared ask before. What if the giant could actually lose? The fight was now only days away, and the closer it came, the more dangerous Chuck Norris seemed. Not because he was stronger, not because he was bigger, but because every day he looked less like a man preparing for combat, and more like a man who had already seen the answer. The night before the fight, Fort Benning didn't sleep. Barracks lights stayed on long after curfew. Hallways filled with whispers. Arguments erupted in cafeterias. Soldiers crowded stairwells and smoking areas, debating the same question over and over again. How long would Chuck Norris last? Some predicted less than a minute. Others thought Dalton Morrow would end it with the first grab. A few believed Chuck might survive longer than expected, but almost nobody believed he could win. And yet, something had changed. A seed of doubt had begun spreading through the base, because the men who watched Chuck train every morning no longer laughed. They had seen something disturbing, something cold, something methodical, something that looked less like preparation and more like certainty. Experienced fighters understand a terrifying truth. The most dangerous man in a fight is rarely the loudest, rarely the strongest, rarely the most intimidating. Sometimes, it's the calmest one. Before sunrise, Chuck Norris sat alone inside his assigned quarters. No reporters, no cameras, no audience. Only silence. Darkness filled the room. For a long time he didn't move, didn't stretch, didn't pace, didn't rehearse victory speeches. He simply sat, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. Outside, military trucks rumbled awake. Boots echoed across concrete. The base slowly came alive. Chuck remained motionless. When he finally stood, he walked toward a mirror. Cold water splashed across his face. He stared at his reflection. There was no fear there, no excitement, no anger. Only calculation. Like a man reviewing the final details of a plan already completed inside his mind. Across the base, Dalton Morrow was awake too. Soldiers passing the training yard stopped and stared. The giant stood beneath floodlights before dawn, shirtless, silent. Steam rose from his enormous body into the cold morning air. What frightened them wasn't what he was doing. It was what he wasn't doing. He wasn't training, wasn't punching, wasn't lifting, wasn't preparing. He simply stood there staring toward the distant ring, like a tank waiting for battle. A young infantryman later described the sight in a single sentence. It looked like watching a mountain think. Even Dalton's closest training partners noticed something unusual. His breakfast remained untouched. His coffee sat cold. Finally, one soldier gathered enough courage to ask, "You okay?" Dalton kept staring forward. No. The answer surprised everyone. Because of Norris? The giant's jaw tightened. For several seconds he said nothing. Then came 4 words that spread through Fort Benning faster than any rumor. Because he isn't afraid. That statement unsettled people more than anything else. Fear was normal. Fear made sense. Every man who stepped near Dalton eventually showed fear. Every man except Chuck Norris. By sunrise, the parade grounds looked like a military stadium. Thousands of soldiers surrounded the ring. Vehicles lined the perimeter. Men climbed rooftops for better views. Others sat atop trucks and water towers. The ring stood at the center beneath powerful floodlights, glowing like an operating table waiting for surgery. The $1 million prize rested beneath heavy security. General Patton arrived shortly afterward, confident, relaxed, cigar already burning between his fingers. Witnesses later claimed he looked amused, as though the fight was little more than entertainment. Then Dalton Marrow entered the ring. The atmosphere changed instantly. Noise vanished. The crowd fell silent. Even soldiers who had seen him countless times felt their stomachs tighten. Under direct sunlight, he looked larger than ever. His shoulders resembled armored plates. His arms looked capable of tearing through walls. Each step made the wooden platform groan beneath his weight. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The scene felt too serious, too dangerous. The giant stood in his corner, silent, still, certain. Then Chuck Norris appeared. At first, nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Compared to Dalton, he looked impossibly small, almost fragile. Yet the closer he came, the quieter people became, because something felt wrong. Chuck wasn't acting like a man walking toward danger. He wasn't trying to appear brave, wasn't forcing confidence, wasn't performing. He looked comfortable, and that terrified people. He climbed into the ring with smooth, effortless movement. Then he stood quietly across from Dalton. The contrast felt surreal. A giant built like a living weapon, a smaller man standing completely unfazed by him. When their eyes met, the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. The referee stepped forward. His voice sounded nervous. "Victory by knockout, submission, or inability to continue." He swallowed, then stepped backward. Silence swallowed the ring. No wind, no whispers. Nothing. Then came a single word. "Fight." Dalton exploded forward. The charge looked terrifying. 350 pounds of momentum launching across the canvas. The ring shook. His arms opened wide, ready to crush, ready to trap, ready to finish. Thousands of soldiers inhaled sharply. They had seen this before. Once Dalton grabbed someone, everything ended. Every time. But Chuck Norris did something nobody expected. He moved toward him. Not away, not sideways, forward, directly into danger. Gasps erupted. For a fraction of a second, the distance vanished. The two men collided. Then reality seemed to break. Years later, soldiers still argued about what happened next. Some claimed Chuck disappeared. Others insisted Dalton stumbled. Most admitted they never truly saw it. One instant, Chuck stood in front of the giant. The next instant, he was behind him. Position secured. Control established. The exact movement he had repeated thousands of times. Perfectly executed. The crowd erupted in confusion.
Dalton reacted instantly. His massive hands clawed at Chuck's arm. Muscles bulged. Veins exploded beneath his skin. The giant pulled with terrifying force. Enough force to bend steel. Enough force to tear ordinary men apart. The ring trembled beneath the effort. Chuck's grip never moved, not even slightly. Because this wasn't strength against strength. This was precision against power. Leverage against muscle. Preparation against instinct. Dalton pulled harder. Sweat burst across his forehead. His face darkened. Still the hold remained, unbreakable. Seconds passed. The giant's movements slowed. The realization hit him, and when it did, fear finally appeared. Not fear of pain, fear of understanding. The choke wasn't attacking his lungs. It wasn't stopping his breathing. It was shutting down blood flow to his brain. The crowd began screaming. Thousands of voices merged into chaos. General Patton rose from his seat. His cigar hung forgotten from his mouth. Nobody had expected this. Nobody. Dalton tried to stand. His legs betrayed him. One knee crashed into the canvas. The platform rattled violently. Chuck adjusted the position slightly. Calm, controlled, precise. Dalton's hands weakened. The giant looked confused now, disoriented, helpless. A sight Fort Benning had never witnessed before. Then both knees hit the canvas. The strongest man on the base knelt beneath a smaller opponent. The image felt impossible. The crowd watched in disbelief. Then it happened. 3 taps. 1, 2, 3. The ring fell silent. Absolute silence. Chuck released the hold immediately, stepped backward, and stood calmly. Dalton remained kneeling, breathing heavily, trying to understand what had just happened. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Thousands of soldiers stared. Then Fort Benning exploded. The roar hit like an avalanche. Men screamed, cheered, jumped, shouted. Officers lost control of the crowd completely. Some soldiers laughed from pure shock. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they had witnessed. Because the giant had fallen. Not after a brutal war, not after a long battle, after mere seconds. Dalton finally lifted his head. His eyes found Chuck. Disbelief still lingered there. Then he spoke. 6 simple words. "I couldn't see you move." The sentence echoed through the stunned crowd. Chuck looked at him quietly, then offered his hand. Dalton accepted. The giant rose to his feet. No hostility, no bitterness, only understanding. Because both men now knew something the crowd did not. The fight had never been about size. It had never been about power. It had never been about intimidation. It had been about preparation.
While thousands celebrated, Chuck walked calmly toward the prize table. The $1 million waited beneath the sunlight, enough money to transform lives forever. Soldiers expected celebration, expected triumph, expected a victory speech. Instead, Chuck picked up the contract, looked at the amount, then crossed it out.
Confused murmur spread through the crowd. He borrowed a pen, wrote a few words, then stepped back. Military officers leaned closer, their eyes widened. The money had been redirected, donated, every dollar, to the base hospital. Silence returned. For a brief moment, even the crowd forgot to cheer, because suddenly the victory became bigger than the fight itself. Chuck Norris had walked into the most intimidating military base in America, defeated the most feared man there, refused a fortune, and left behind a lesson. As reporters rushed forward shouting questions, Chuck paused near the ropes. One journalist yelled the question everyone wanted answered. "Weren't you afraid?" Chuck stopped, turned, and smiled faintly. "Fear is normal." The crowd listened. "But when fear controls your thinking," he paused, "the fight is already over." Then he stepped down from the ring and walked away. No celebration, no arrogance, no victory pose, just calm footsteps disappearing through the crowd. Behind him, Dalton Marrero watched silently. Finally, one soldier approached the giant. "You okay?" Dalton never looked away from Chuck. "No." The soldier frowned. "Because you lost?" The giant slowly shook his head. His answer would spread through Fort Benning for decades. "Because today I learned strength isn't the most dangerous thing in combat." As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, Chuck Norris left Fort Benning the same way he arrived. Quietly, without fanfare, without demanding attention. The black sedan rolled through the gates and disappeared down the highway. But the story never disappeared. Years later, old soldiers would still tell it. Not as the story of a giant who lost, not as the story of $1 million, not even as the story of Chuck Norris. They told it because of what they learned that day. A lesson stronger than any punch, sharper than any weapon, more dangerous than raw power. Because on that unforgettable morning, thousands of soldiers watched a man defeat a monster. And in doing so, he shattered an illusion that many of them had carried their entire lives. Strength can dominate. Size can intimidate. Power can terrify. But preparation can change destiny. And sometimes the calmest man in the room is the one everyone should fear the most.